I've got two sessions to do with you with a kind of break in between. And I'm kind of sticking with the themes that are on the syllabus, so that the morning, the first talk, is really just kind of foundations within Judaism of approaching the question of human rights and specifically religious freedom, because I understand that's really more of a focus for you than some of the other issues connected to human rights. And in the second one, I'm kind of shifting it a little bit and thinking of how Jews in practice kind of negotiate their place in society. In the United States and Canada will be the first focus as a minority, and in Israel as a majority. Now, the way you have been prepared is, you've read David Novik's piece, and you will see that some of the things that I say in the first piece this morning echo things that he says, but I'll tell you that I'm not following his exact trajectory of the way that he looks at the issue, because it just in my own mind I kind of organize it a little bit differently than he approaches it. And in the second piece, the North American thing, I haven't really read anything about at all, so my thinking is to start off with the North American piece, which I'll kind of to you in a certain sense, and then kind of throw open a discussion on the Israel reality. I have material here which I'll put up for you that is different than the material that you saw from the U.S. State Department, but it doesn't so much contradict it. It agrees with the basic bottom line of that document. But what it does is it provides a certain overarching philosophical framework to understand some of the facts that you encounter in that U.S. State Department document, which are not really explained from a philosophical, religious standpoint. Like, what are the ideological tensions that lead to some of the issues that are that the state of Israel is dealing with, as discussed in that particular document. So, my approach to these things, I'm going to kind of walk you through these texts. I always kind of feel that the job of a of a professor is just to find the texts. You find the texts and you put them in front of the student. Hopefully, have something intelligent to say about them. But at any point in time, if you have questions about the text, if you have responses to the text, please interrupt me. Like, I will not consider it an interruption. I will consider it as part of our time together. And even though there's between the two lectures, I've got 14 pages of text here. It's not because I actually think I can show you 14 pages of text. It's just because I like to be secure and to know that should there be dead air, I've got something up here to kind of show you. Okay, so the first topic, as I said, is just foundational perspectives on Judaism and human rights. And you saw that David Novik made the point that some people try to argue that there really isn't human rights in Judaism. There aren't really rights. There are just duties or obligations. He rejects that. And from my own personal understanding of the topic, I think he's right on. And what I'm going to do here is kind of show you certain key texts here. But I want to start off with a caveat, which is that all of you guys who study religion know for every text that says X, you can find a text the exact opposite within the tradition. Especially when you're looking at a tradition in which we now have texts accumulated, over a 3,000-year period. Now, there isn't going to be a text that says man isn't created in God's image. No, there isn't going to be a text like that. So that's kind of a foundational concept. When it comes to how it translates in terms of the way we deal with people who are not Jewish, that's where you get lots of action. Now, I'm kind of only going to indicate very slightly the counter voices, of which there are many. It's just because there isn't enough time to give balanced voice. So what I'm going to do is kind of show you the texts that support a vision of human rights that is supportive of religious pluralism and religious within the context of a religious mind frame. And I'm not going to really show you all that much about the texts that are counter voices to that, but I will indicate to you what the concerns are of the people who kind of put up the counter voice texts. So we start off, as we often do when we're dealing with Jewish stuff, with the Bible. And the Bible has two creation stories, as many of you know. And the first one, when it comes to the creation of humans, is said God created the human in God's image. In the image of God, God created him. Male and female, he created them, and God blessed them. Now, of course, as you can imagine, there's a lot of conversation. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? You saw that they kind of looked at it from a perspective of kind of the ability to think and reflect. But of course, that's a problem, because what happens if you're, severely mentally disabled? Does that mean somehow that your divine image is compromised? So there's a number of people who have tried to kind of not necessarily take such a cerebral reading of what the human image of God really is. But the bottom line is, if humans are an image of God, that it naturally flows that certain dignities should come to them. And that kind of serves as the basis. Now, notice here, it said God created the human in God's image. It doesn't say God created Jews in God's image. And indeed, even the most, right-wing conservative interpretation of the Garden of Eden story would not say that Adam were Jewish. Right? Would even argue about whether Noah is a Jew. Right? And would not see kind of Jews really coming onto the biblical story until Abraham. So that everything that is, happening beforehand is basically happening with the world as a whole, not with one particular subgroup called Jews within it. So this statement in Genesis is not only the basis of the dignity of Jews, it is the basis of the dignity of all people. Now, there have been some people, as I tried to show you in this passage from the later rabbinic tradition, who have some rabbis who argued, you know what? That God image thing is not the most important concept, really, the most fundamental concept. Really, the most fundamental concept is the statement in the book of Leviticus, later on in the Bible, that love your neighbor as yourself. But in general, this has kind of been rejected. And the general Jewish approach is to imagine that the Genesis statement about God, about people, is more powerful than the Leviticus statement, because what happens if I don't love myself? I hate myself. Or what happens if I deny kinds of things, and therefore feel like I should therefore deny everybody else those things? Right? So the way one approaches oneself is not necessarily a good stepping stone. One should imagine approaching people beyond oneself. Now, there's a whole bunch of kind of beautiful kind of statements, I think they're beautiful at least, in the tradition that kind of reflect on the fact that, even though we are now, multiple billions of people in the world, according to the biblical story, people are created, with two. It all starts with two, right? Theoretically, God could have, created a little city. He could have said, let there be Montreal, and 3 million people could have come down at the same time, right? We kind of smile or whatever, but logically, off with two. If your goal is to have everything populated, why not, start off with, really putting the number of people on Earth that you want, putting them all down at one time. So the tradition here says that Adam was created alone to teach us that anyone who wastes one life in this world, the Torah treats them as though they had wasted a full world, right? Because every individual, the whole world stemmed from one individual. So if you kill one person, you're killing everything that stemmed from them or could stem from them. It's equivalent to a world in itself. Also it says the reason why people were created singular is for the peace of creation, so that no person could say to another, my ancestor was greater than yours. And also to demonstrate God's greatness. How does that work? Because when a person stamps coins, how many coins does he make from one mold, and yet all are alike? God stamps every person with the mold of the first person, and none are alike. Therefore, everyone is required to say, for my sake the world was created. Right? So as you can imagine, this then provides a basis for, according to individuals, tremendous significance, tremendous love, tremendous caring, and the dignity that naturally should flow from that, and the rights, to express themselves that should naturally flow from that. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the concept of in the body chosen people, right? The idea that the Jews are the chosen people. And of course that raises all kinds of questions in terms of our issue, in that does it mean to say that the Jews are the chosen people, that God cares about them more? Now here's an area where there are dissenting voices. In other words, there are definite voices in the tradition that would say, yes, God cares about the Jews more. And if so, this might not necessarily touch on the essential human dignity of every person, but it might touch in some way on their essential worth. In other words, Jews might have more value because they are greater value to God. This strand definitely exists within the tradition. Today, it is a minority view. But there have definitely been times in Jewish history where it was much more of a widespread view. But even at times where, the tradition could be read this way, early on there were still statements in the tradition kind of pushing in another way, right? So you have in the prophet Amos, you have, are you not like the children of the Cushites to me, O children of Israel, says the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Kaftor, and Aram from Kir? In other words, you're just one of the nations, Don't imagine that I don't care about everybody else. I care about everybody else. And then in the rabbinic tradition, which is later than that particular text, you have this statement. God said to Moses, is there anyone whom I do not respect, whether it be Israelite or Gentile, man or woman, slave or maid? Whoever does a good deed shall find the reward at its side. So in other words, it's not who you are, but what you do that matters to me. This rabbinic tradition has God saying. And of course, in here you have a very interesting hierarchy or division here to see how the rabbis thought, that there was a clear distinction between Israelite, Gentile, man or woman, slave or handmaid, and that these things could theoretically impact on the way God would see you. But no, they don't. Right? So that there could be an issue here is recognized. So this all translates early on in the Bible into clear statements. If people are created in God's image, they have certain rights. If everybody is in God's image, then those rights should be universal, at least to a certain extent. And you see that very clearly in these couple of biblical passages that I wanted to show you. So these are, when strangers sojourn within your land, you shall not do them wrong. The strangers who sojourn with you shall be to you as the natives among you, and you shall love them as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Israel. Or there shall be law, I think that's a mistake, it should be one law for the citizen and for the stranger who dwells among you. In Deuteronomy, you shall not abuse a needy and destitute labor, whether a fellow Israelite or a stranger, in one of the communities of your land. In other words, that there needs to be a certain legal system, and that legal system has to be equal. There has to be a societal system, and that system has to be equal. And the general tie-in here is the human dignity, as you see here in the Bible, the tie-in often has to do with Egypt and the Jewish experience as slaves in Egypt. Basically, you guys know what it was like to be an enslaved minority, so therefore it is incumbent upon you to treat others at a higher level. And there's a whole bunch of commentators who would say the whole purpose of the Jews as slaves was for them to become sensitive to the needs of the disadvantaged. Right, and that would be a very dominant trend within rabbinic self-understanding. But the same texts that say this also say, as I'm sure many of you know, when you enter the land of Canaan, kill all the other nations who are there and destroy them. Right, so these texts kind of say, well, the people who are left, treat them in this way. But when you enter the land of Israel, get rid of all the other nations, right? The biblical perspective, as many of you know, is that God has given the land of Israel to the Israelites because the other nations who live there have lost their rights to the land because of their There's, of course, all different ways of responding to those particular passages, and I'm just going to kind of give you two, potential ways of, and I'm talking about the passage which calls for the destruction of the nation. So one voice, which is definitely a clear voice adopting the tradition, says this is not to be understood as an ongoing command. Right? Some of you might know that within the Jewish tradition, starting in the Middle Ages, it became kind of, for a certain period of a few hundred years, became kind of, I wouldn't say hip, that would be the wrong word, but common to try to go through the Bible and find where are the 613 commandments, because the rabbinic tradition says there are 613 commandments. But so you're familiar with the Bible. It's not like when you're reading it goes, Commandment 1, Commandment 2, Commandment 3, right? So where are the 613 commandments? Even the 10 commandments is complicated in that sense, because the first one is not a commandment, it's an announcement, right? So does that even go into the list of the 613 commandments? So most of the people who did these lists did not include the command to destroy the nations upon entering of Israel into the list of 613 commandments. They did not perceive it to be an ongoing command, but rather a one-time command based on the historical realities of that particular situation. The Jews were coming in as a fragile minority with a new religious vision into a territory that was with people with a different religious vision. And this stream of the tradition says, in order for this small little plant, in a sense, root, it needed to be protected from all the other influences, especially influences that had been so discredited that God took the land from them in the first place. But of course, that probably will not be satisfying, to everyone in this room, as you can imagine, because, if you take the Bible literally, that's still, maybe you can understand philosophically why that might be necessary, but bottom line is, thousands of people get killed in that image, right? So it's a peculiar one to necessarily wrap your head around with, but the important thing to keep in mind is that the tradition doesn't see it as an ongoing commandment, for the most part, with a few exceptions. And of course, the other way of looking at it is to say that the whole Bible is not a historically accurate document, and that, none of this may have happened in the first place, so there's a limit to how much you kind of have to lash yourself in penance for something that perhaps didn't ever occur in the first place, and it was just kind of the reflection of the tradition. So the important thing really becomes with those types of verses is what you do with them. Right? Do you say, God said when you enter the land of Israel, you got to get rid of all the nations. So that means the state of Israel has to banish all the Arabs living within its territory. That's where the action is. If you use the biblical verses to come to that point of view, that's where the action is in terms of theology, in terms of human rights. how you read the biblical text and come to terms with it is kind of on a separate plane if you don't seek to translate that into concrete actions of the time. So as you can see here, there's definitely the basis in the Bible for imagining both Jews and non-Jews as having certain important rights and analogous rights. On the other hand, I would not be truthful to you if I didn't tell you that there isn't a voice in the Bible, the voice that says, nations that definitely wouldn't accord those particular nations, for whatever reason, the basic human right of existing, which is the most basic of all human rights. Yeah, well, 90% don't interact with any of these texts and are not having this and couldn't care less. I mean, that's honest, right? We're all students of religion, so we care about these things. But the basic bottom line is that, first of all, in North America, some 30 to 50% of the population, depending on how you slice it, and how broad a definition of who is a Jew you're doing, is really quite disaffiliated from the Jewish group, and is kind of like Larry David or Seinfeld, to pick on the same kind of thing, right? So Larry David knows he's a Jew, and there's a fascinating. Did you guys watch this show, Curb Your Enthusiasm? Okay, so if you want to see, it's on the internet. Not that I'm going to encourage you to download. I am because it's not yet on DVD. In this last, there was a hysterical episode called Palestinian Chicken. You guys have to watch it to get a sense of like a pretty disaffiliated and on a practical level Jew struggling with his Jewish identity versus his non-Jewish identity. So it's a fascinating thing, right? But for many Jews, being a Jewish is not something that they deny, but is not necessarily something that they are interacting with on a very profound way. And then for other Jews, Judaism is, the rituals that you do and whatever. And when they come to some of the issues concerning the land of Israel, they approach it as a Canadian or as an American or as a Frenchman or as a Brit. They don't funnel their response through a Jewish lens, right? And then you have another group that is very ideologically inclined and using these texts largely to forward kind of a right-wing agenda in terms of the land of Israel, which has led to a left-wing backlash where you now have more leftists also going to these texts and saying, hey, yeah, there's that text, but, 3 paragraphs down, there's this text too. Right, so you have a discussion like this, but I don't want to mislead anyone that this is what Jews are doing, is the most number one thing on their mind. The number one thing on their mind as Jews is, what kind of Jewish education, for example, am I going to give my kid? That's a much more compelling issue. Am I going to send them to afternoon school? I'm going to send them to summer camp? These are bigger issues that loom larger in most Jews' mind than some of these issues as Jews. Any thoughts or comments on what I've shown you so far? No, 100%, except that we should get race, because no Jews see themselves as a race. Jews would see themselves as a nationality or an ethnicity. Because a race has a conception of a certain biological line. And if Jews saw themselves as fundamentally having a certain biological line, then you couldn't convert into it very easily, right? Because you could never be part of that biological line. Judaism has no trouble at all with people from all different backgrounds converting into it. So there's never really been a racial thing. And plus, in light of the Holocaust, Jews in general, you know, the hair on their back of the neck as it stands up when a racial used in relation to them. So you're correct, but only instead of race, say nationality or ethnicity, and that would kind of cover it. Yeah. So because of the fact that Jews are both an ethnicity and a religion, it is possible to not act at all with them and still be Jewish. It is possible to have varying, understandings of things and still be Jewish. Right? I know every time I teach students who are firmly rooted in Islam, they're thrown off by the fact that a Jew can say because it's so much a key point in understanding what it means to be a Muslim. But it's not when it comes to being a Jew, although it's for sure there. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, no, this is great. It's actually going to pop up a little bit in the second talk because we're going to talk about Jewish North America. We're going to see that concern for social justice issues is a primary concern, and we're going to see a critique of that kind of comes, I think, from some of the thinking that you're giving. But just quickly here, my own personal prejudice is. Art Green, who you're about to encounter, because my presentation is kind of peppered with quotes from his work, kind of made an interesting point when I first met him, 15 or so years ago, when I was still a doctoral student, and we were talking about why he keeps certain phrases in the liturgy that he doesn't believe in. And for me, that was something I was perplexed about, and he told me that fundamentally, Judaism has to be perceived as a language, and you either talk the language or you don't talk the language. So I kind of am very partial to that type of point of view. In other words, you can believe in God or not believe in God. I don't think that's the essential part. The essential part is whether you tie into some of this language. Are you willing to say that man is created in image as a way of expressing the concept and dignity of humanity, or are you not? Because if you divorce yourself completely from the Jewish language, then you're not really embedded in the culture. And what you do, I think, could be still beautiful and wonderful, but it can't be really a significant expression of the culture. In other words, if you say, it's my Judaism that's making me do that, but you don't really study the tradition, and so how do you know it's your Judaism that's making you do that, and not just the fact that you are an upper class, urbanite, right? Because there's lots of research that indicates that certain kind of perspectives on the world are very much tied to economics and educational attainment, and whether you live in a city or whether you live in a rural area, right? So personally, I think you have to kind of speak and interact with this vocabulary for you to be able to argue that you're Jewish, that your social justice is really Jewish. Now, the other thing which you can interact with, doesn't have to be text, is Jewish history. If you interact with Jewish history and the lessons that you see in Jewish history, I think that also works. But if not, you're kind of just saying kind of an amorphous, I believe that this comes from my Judaism. there's nothing wrong. I don't want to take that away from anybody, but I don't believe that it is very culturally enriching. Well, Judaism is non-proselytizing, but I think a lot of that is historical. In other words, if Judaism didn't, in the time of the Maccabee Wars, going back some 2,200 years ago, the Maccabees, when they won, did some pretty heavy proselytizing. So, but I think a lot of it is connected to historical circumstance. But it could very well be that the historical circumstance has been so pronounced that it's molded Jewish psychology. Yeah, in Judaism, as it probably came out, land is something that you merit, right? And the Bible continuously say, this is a land that vomits out its inhabitants. If you do not do what you're supposed to do, this land will not support you. So in that sense, it is a right, but a right that comes with very strong obligations. And if you don't live up to your obligations and your duties, you kind of forfeit the right to exercise that right, in the biblical piece. Now, how about freedom of religion, right? Because we saw a lot of biblical quotes here about, judiciary and stuff like that. And it was very clear. You should have one judicial system for every sector of society, Jewish, non-Jewish. But what about religion? Right, I already told you that the Bible said that when you come to the land of Israel, you have to obliterate the other religions. What is the early kind of biblical approach of Judaism to other religions? Well, it is to view them as right? Early Judaism very clearly views other religions as invalid. Right? In other words, that they are just not true. Just absolutely not true. And that is why the Jewish prayer book to this day contains within it the following passage. And this is not a kind of tangential passage of the Jewish liturgy, because it's prayed in every religious service. Jews pray 3 times a day. So this is in 3 religious services. Jews encounter the following passage, where it says that we hope in you, Hashem our God, that we may soon see your mighty splendor, to remove detestable idolatry from the earth, and false gods will be utterly cut off, to perfect the universe through the Almighty's sovereignty. Then all humanity will call upon your name, to turn all the earth's wicked towards you. All the inhabitants of the world will recognize and know that to you every knee should bend, every tongue should swear. Right, so the deeply embedded within the Jewish tradition is this concept that the other religions of the world, definitely the ones that existed in the time of the Bible, so these are kind of, not really talking about about Christianity and Islam, although Christianity does come into the scene already by the time this passage is incorporated in the tradition as part of the prayer book. But to view the religions around the time of the Bible is just based on false gods, false understanding of divinity, and therefore it's having no basic religious validity. And as a result of that, that there will come a time when all the nations of the world will realize that they're basically praying to nothingness, and they will come into the proper understanding. Right? Now, this is like all passages, right? You can interpret it in such a way that, well, it doesn't refer to these people, right? So if I'm a Jew living in a predominantly Islamic environment, as Jews did, let's say, up until the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, there were sizable Jewish communities, let's say, within North Africa, in Morocco and Iraq, etc., living under Islamic, Islamic cultural realities. Right? A good argument could be made that when the text talks about idolatry, it's not talking about Islam, because Islam is so anti-idolatry. Surely enough, Jews living in the Islamic world would kind of tell their neighbors, this prayer doesn't talk about you. It talks about other people, but not you, because you guys are not idol worshippers. Muhammad, came out fiercely against the concept of idol worship. And who would be talking about the Christians. Now, Jews living under Christian would say, well, it's not talking about you. It's talking about someone else. And you could always find an argument for it. It's a little bit touchier when it comes, frankly, to Catholicism, because there's iconography and stuff like that, which is a bit more problematic from a biblical standpoint, but definitely Protestantism could, definitely can be easily reconciled with passages such as this. But what you don't have in the tradition, right, is a great sense that all of the world's religions are an expression of God's will, and each reflects a different conversation that God is having with different people. Now, you can find that in some texts here and there, whatever, but it would be wrong of me that is a dominant approach in the pre-modern world. Now, in practice, it didn't really much matter because the Jews had power. Right? So Jews living in medieval Europe or Jews living in medieval North Africa, right, they were a minority, and what their basic feeling was towards Islam or Christianity both mattered and didn't matter. Like, it had a certain internal significance, but it had no external expression, right? There was no possibility to have to kind of think these things through. Jews didn't interact with Christians or Muslims in a way, for most of the time. There were exceptions to which there was really dialogue between religions in terms of the content of their religious traditions and its validity. There wasn't a lot of that type of interaction, and at the same time, Christians were convinced that Islam and Judaism were wrong, and Islam was convinced that basically Christianity and Judaism were fundamentally wrong on a kind of a base level, because there was a new revelation that superseded it and encompassed all that was good within it, within what was previously released. So Jews were not unique in this way. The Jewish kind of feeling that there's a certain truth in Judaism that is lacking in the other religions, I don't think is unique to Judaism throughout, the rabbinic period, the Middle Ages. Where everything starts getting interesting is in the modern period, right? Because in the modern, you have, interactions within groups within the context of a free society, in many cases. While there sometimes was religious interaction with, amongst Jews and Christians and Jews and Muslims beforehand, it all took place in a very hypercharged environment, right? So, for example, there were a couple of times within the medieval Jewish experience where Jews were called upon to defend the Jewish tradition in a public disputation against usually a convert to a Jewish convert to Christianity, and these would take place kind of in a big square. But you didn't have to watch CNN to know that if the Jews would mount too convincing an argument and would, by some chance, win, they would lose. They would lose big time. Right? Because this was not kind of a free intellectual environment where, to defeat Christianity in the public square in France or Spain of the Middle Ages would be considered a great victory, that would be celebrated. It would endanger the community more than, secure it. So, whatever disputes took place, with certain exceptions, there are certain periods in Jewish history, in world history, where it's a little different, but as a rule, whatever kind of theological discussion took place between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, in history have always taken place a bit in a supercharged, and that is not comparable in any way to the contemporary environment. You have, as I said, like your small moments where you have greater dialogue. There's an interesting piece of time in Spain in the 12th and 13th century, where there's an interesting conversation taking place around the basis of the philosophy of Aristotle that's involving Christians and Jews and Muslims, and they're each reading each other's writings, and they're each interacting with each other's writings in kind of an interesting way. But these are all philosophers whose approaches to God and approaches to revelation were much more modern in a certain sense in their orientation than a lot of what was taking place around them. So you do have some of this stuff, but some of this type of interaction, like you have not a lot of it. So when it comes to religious freedom, in other words, can Jews living in Canada really buy into the concept that all of Canada's religions are equally valid and form an important part of the mosaic of cultural life in Canada? Or in Israel, can the state of Israel really say that Jerusalem is a city of three religions? Or would they really say is we're stuck with it? Because the religions are here, but we would be very happy if they were gone, not for political reasons, but for logical, philosophical, theological reasons, right? So that's where I want to kind of get to here in the remaining moments that we have for this talk, and to present to you two thinkers that have given a religious basis for religious pluralism. Two Jewish thinkers that provide a basis for Jewishly rooted pluralism, right? Because just like I told you, 80% of the Jewish community or so is not involved in the type of conversation that we're having today and the way that we're having it. You could do the same thing with pluralism, right? Why do I need to worry about whether Judaism says that Canadian mosaic is good? Isn't it sufficient that I say, I think it's good? And what does Judaism say? Well, that's important, in the Faculty of Religious Studies, but it's not important for me as an individual, right? But these are people who want to give a religious basis for their pluralism. They want Judaism to endorse pluralism. And to do that, they have to kind of dig, right? Because there's a lot of statements within the tradition which don't endorse pluralism in the way that we would normally conceive of it. So I've given you one perspective that comes from the Orthodox world and one perspective that comes from the non-Orthodox Jewish world. And the difference, as many of you know, is that an Orthodox Jew will affirm revelation of the Bible, right? Will believe that the Bible is the revealed word of God. And a non-Orthodox Jew, with very, very few exceptions, will not. And this has many, many, many ramifications for the way they view all kinds of things. So I've given you a lot of texts here from Yitzhak Greenberg, but we obviously cannot look at all of them. So I'm going to just quickly point out one of the things, but I can definitely give to Dan these files, and then you can play with them at home. This is something which you can try at home. Right, the early book of Genesis has two covenants, at least two covenants between of God and people in it, right? So Greenberg talks about here this first covenant is the covenant with Noah, and I interspersed in here the actual passage from Genesis which talks about what this covenant is, and he argues that this covenant with Noah, which is a covenant with all humanity, is never been rescinded. In other words, God has entered in the book of Genesis into a covenant with all of humanity, which of course gives every group on earth a certain level of human dignity. And then he goes on to say that the Jewish covenant, he says, is a sub-partnership of this larger covenant with humanity. And the role of the Jews here is very interesting, and I suggest you take a look at it. It's basically as teachers and as role models, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. You can take a look at it. And what I wanted to show you here is a statement that I found from Greenberg in an interview that he did for BeliefNet to mark the publication of his book on Jewish-Christian dialogue. So Yitzhak Greenberg is an Orthodox Jew, a fully practicing Orthodox Jew and rabbi, and he also has a PhD in American history. But I should tell you that he is on the left wing of the Orthodox. So it would be misleading you if I told you that this is the Orthodox perspective. This is an Orthodox perspective. It is far from being the dominant Orthodox perspective. But it just shows you that it is possible to have a perspective such as this and still come from Orthodoxy. How does this work? So let's read this together. He says, that's why pluralism is so key. The weakness of either the relativist or the fundamentalist position is that you get a new absolutism. Absolutism where it says there's only one way. Why? In Soviet Russia, in order to get rid of religion, to bring a better world, they ended up with a new absolute that persecuted Jews and Christians and others. Right? A strong feeling of communism that led to one of the greatest persecutions of in Jewish history. Right? So relativism, according to Greenberg, inevitably turns into a new absolutism. It's a powerful force of homogenization. No religions make a difference, so it becomes a global religion of materialism and consumerism. The triumph of relativism means you can't make judgments, you can't make value statements. It cripples the capacity to call wrong wrong, the capacity of good to defend itself against evil. In the end, it tends to become an oppressive form, either by law or through a tyranny of opinion that mocks religion and tries to drive it away. Right? That's a mouthful. You can think about it on your 12-hour trips back to your home countries. But he's in part he's kind of saying here, right, that when you say I'm okay, you're okay, it's really hard to argue for any truth. Right, so you want to have pluralism, but do you want to have a situation where you say Christianity and Judaism are equal because neither of them have truth? Right, the good thing, my colleague Carlos Franco always reminds me about the Middle Ages is when they had nations, they believed that there was such a thing as truth. The question was who had it, but they were willing to affirm it. They were willing to affirm that there is a correct morality and a correct vision of God and that there is a certain truth. A lot of our conversation says, of course I'll accept every religion because they're equally as untrue. Right? So that's not necessarily the type of acceptance that religious groups would want. So he then continues on to say the danger the other way with fundamentalism is, again, that religion becomes a source of violence and hatred in the name of God. So what's the answer, right? There's always an answer when you reject the other points of view. God's call to our generation is to turn this exposure of religions to one another in a pluralist society into a source of life and goodness, not death and evil. And that is to be done through giving up, not through giving up religion, but to modulate and understand our worldviews in relation to one another, making room for variety and disagreement, an affirmation of diversity, which reflects God's love for humans and human diversity. If God spoke to me, that doesn't mean that God never spoke to anybody else. If I've made a good religion, that doesn't mean nobody else has made a good religion. That's the key breakthrough. Only pluralism can protect against the kind of absolute totalitarian tendencies present to the left and to the right. Now, how is this going to work and why is this a positive thing? Later on in the interview, he says the following. It's impossible to make a perfect balance of social justice and spiritual perfection. This is after a conversation that he's had about Judaism and Christianity. And he says Judaism has been very focused on national good, and Christianity has been very focused on the individual good. And each has excelled in that area. But he says, it's difficult to find a perfect balance between those two things of body and soul. So at any one time, one of these religions is emphasizing more the body and one the soul. But if they would see this as a disagreement for the sake of heaven, they would incorporate the other's insights, and each would rebalance in an ongoing, dynamic way. And the truth is, that's what's happening. Christianity in modern times went back and reread the Hebrew scriptures, the prophets, and they have incorporated more of that. So, bottom line here, I'm not sure if the quotes kind of give you the whole picture, but the bottom line here, Greenberg is saying that yes, there have been multiple revelations. God has made multiple revelations. Revelations exist. Christians have a revelation. Muslims have a revelation. God has spoken to multiple people. And the general divine plan is for each group to be a corrective to the other. In other words, as time goes on, each religion develops its own focus, and that focus is something that it lands up doing really well. But it often will then neglect another aspect of the potential ideal, the potential religious life, which the other religion might do very well. So in conversation amongst the different religious groups, each religion can gain from the exposure to the other and kind of say, Judaism is very legal focused. And that has its strengths, Christians, which you could pay attention to. But your argument against our concern with the law and our perhaps fixation of the law has some truth in it. And we've got to figure out how to balance your emphasis on spirit and our emphasis on law, and come up with some sort of midway point that might be more productive for either of our groups, right? Because this is coming from Greenberg, who's in the context of a book on Jewish-Christian dialogue, so this is what he's not really dealing with Islam in this book at all. So basically what Greenberg is saying, you can believe that what the Bible says is true without to denigrate that what the other religions have in their sacred texts is true also, right? Why imagine that God only has one thing to say? Why imagine that God doesn't want to speak to multiple people? And, as Berg then goes on to say, Judaism has been much enhanced by Christianity and Islam because some of the core principles of Judaism have been carried forth by these two religions to the extent that they now reach 2 billion people and more, while Judaism is still a religion of between 13 and 14 million people. But on any given Sunday, there's a lot of references being made to the book of Psalms. Right? And why is that? That's because of the influence of Judaism on Christianity, and Christianity carried things into the public domain, and Jews should see that as positive and should see that as part of the divine plan. Well, not really, because he believes very strongly that every group has its unique thing to contribute to the mosaic of religious thinking. And if you abandon your group, then you drop the ball and you drop that which you can contribute. And he believes that Judaism has a great amount to contribute. Well, no, because he's not one of these thinkers, kind of like there are thinkers, in the non-Orthodox movements who would say Christians have developed a certain ritual practice which is really positive, so let's incorporate it into our tradition. He won't go there. He won't go there. So what he's basically saying is that you keep the 613 commandments, you continue your connection to the Jewish people, you continue your connection to the land of Israel and to the state of Israel, but through a dialogue with Christians and Muslims and other groups, you uncover a different way of thinking that can be enriching of your way of thinking, that you for sure do not abandon your way of thinking, and you're still 98% rooted in your community, just having a conversation. I see where you're coming from, but he doesn't view it that way because he accepts the fact that every religion sees its religion as truth, and he affirms the right of everybody in their religion to assert that they have truth, right? So it's not this kind of vision that would say we don't really know what the truth is. right? I'll give you on the liberal side of things. There's a congregation here in Montreal on the Jewish side of things called Dorshei Emet, which translates into the English as seekers of truth. But the basic feeling in that group is we're seeking truth, but we don't know if we'll ever find it. And we don't know what it is, right? Yeah, but this would be a sense of truth that transcends historical situations, right? Because every religion has its truth that comes from God, so it transcends, it transcends my personal opinion. So I see that there's a tinge, there's like a little bit of what you're saying definitely in here, but he would say because of the fact that he believes that every religion comes from God, right, and he affirms what religions say about themselves, so that gives each religion a certain standing on the truth continuum that relativism won't usually ascribe. So it's very keen thinking on your part, but he would kind of try to answer it on this part. He would say God himself, why argue? See, Maimonides, for example, in the Middle Ages, had this feeling that God has to be totally one and totally unified, and therefore, can only have one thought, like one way of thinking, whatever. But Greenberg doesn't accept that. Why, God who is, why can't God be perceived as a multifaceted being who has, within him multiple senses of truth, as long as there is a certain unity of moral vision. In other words, you can't have a God who says, "Oh, kill, don't kill." But surely you can have a God that says, "Go on pilgrimage to, to Mecca," or go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Surely God can accept that level of diversity. Well, yes and no, because I think, on kind of the basic moral foundations of society, there's a fair amount of uniformity. Yeah, well, I'm pretty sure Greenberg really isn't thinking about those people, right? Because he's thinking about Jews, the interactions Jews have in the countries in which they live, right? So Jews are not really interacting with, say, cannibalistic cultures. But I have no doubt that he say that that's something that God's drawn the line on. So he would say that's not true. Yeah, well, I think you're right in saying that he will not accept everything as mirroring God's truth. There will be certain things that he'll say don't mirror God's truth. And I guess that's part of what I guess makes him less relativistic, right? Because he's willing very strongly to draw certain lines. Yeah, well, I think I don't know. He doesn't really respond to this type of criticism in the writings that I've seen. So you're always on shaky ground when you try to enter somebody else's thinking and try to respond to it. So I don't know what more I could say beyond what I've said without already kind of answering as me instead of answering as him. So let me just give you in 2 minutes what comes below, just so you'll have an orient. The quotation that I gave you from Art Green, or the series of quotations that I gave you from Art Green, are interesting. He's a liberal Jew. He was trained as a conservative rabbi, but he now considers himself post-denominational, and he's in fact running a rabbinical school at Hebrew College in Boston that is decidedly non-denominational. There's elements of his thinking that you could kind of say are kind of left-wing on the liberal side, some things that are more in line with conservative or orthodox thinking. But what's interesting is, right, so far all the perspectives, Greenberg too, comes from the biblical idea that man is created in God's image, and that is the image of Genesis. Image of Genesis, right, is the image of a world that is created external to God. What is interesting about Art Green's point of view is that Art Green comes to the same conclusions about human dignity and the essential value of people, but he arrives at it from a Jewish mystic point of view, which is his intellectual source. And the Jewish mystical approach to creation is different than the biblical approach to creation, at least the literal biblical approach to creation, because the Jewish mystical tradition does not see the world as created external to God, but rather it sees the world as created within God. And therefore, everything within the world is inherently divine. So it is taking the whole question of divine image and kind of ratcheting it up, 200-fold, in a sense. Because it's not that we're just created in the divine image. We are a piece of the divine. And of course, if we are a piece of the divine, then that accords us, for sure, all the same stuff that we've been talking about in terms of image of the divine. And for him, the whole question of religious pluralism, as you'll see here, is like for all liberal Jews a much more easy thing to navigate, because like all liberal Jews, Green doesn't believe that the Bible is revealed. He doesn't believe he has to reconcile necessarily his points of view with every single quotation that people like me can put up on in a file, right? And he's willing to say, well, that's X person thought that way, but I don't think that way, which is what makes him a liberal Jew. So for him, it's very clear that there is the whole world is manifestation of divinity, and all of religions are human creations, and therefore no religion is of greater significance than another religion, except the significance that I myself see in it, right? So Judaism is very important to me because I'm a Jew. Christianity is very important for Dan because he's a Christian. But beyond that, beyond like my own personal connection to things, there is no external thing that makes religion A more significant than religion B, because they are all equally human creations. My hunch, though, is Green would tell the people who endorse cannibalism that they've got some work to do. In other words, that they haven't, thought this through enough, and that they endorse something which is unacceptable, fundamentally unacceptable. I can't think of any thinker I've ever studied within the context of my work who would say, in the Jewish tradition is understood to be revolting against human sacrifice in the story of the binding of Isaac, and that's been a kind of bottom line, you can't cross it type perspective within the Jewish tradition since then, with again very few exceptions. So I hope. Yeah, well, that's what he talked. He has a whole section about what are the commandments that come from knowing that a person is God's image. So the one, to me, I always thought don't set people on fire is a pretty easy one, personally, coming from where I'm coming from. But where the most challenging one I found is that he says, if you believe that man is created, that man is divinity in a certain sense, not the totality of divinity, but a piece of it, then everybody is inherently interesting to you. Everybody is inherently interesting to you because everybody brings another piece of divinity to the table. So, when I'm in synagogue and some people start talking to me, and maybe I'm not really interested in what they're saying, right? Art Green's voice often pops into my head, and he says, this person is a piece of divinity. You should find them inherently interesting. Okay. I'll try to figure this one out. What's interesting about it? But yes, your answer is better than, the bottom line gets drawn because of the divine image concept. And it gets even, more heightened in Green because, the religious imagery there is that we all are pieces of the divine. including plants and including animals, and therefore all of these things have to be treated with respect and care. And in fact, for Green, that is one of the primary lures of his thinking, is that it supports environmental